Welcome, people. Al Iverson here. We will get started in just a moment. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Today, we are going to talk about Microsoft sender requirements and how it fits into the context of the broader sender requirements across the industry, with a particular focus on MAGY. That's Microsoft, Apple, Google, and Yahoo. Run through all the stuff you see on the screen there. Let's kick it off with introductions. Jen, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Definitely. Hi, I'm Jennifer Nespola-Lance. I'm the VP of Industry Relations and Deliverability at Kickbox. So I run our deliverability team here. I also support the verification company side of the business as well. So I help with design of that and helping customers get set up and decisions about what to do with your data once you have it.
Thank you, Jen. Hi, everybody. I'm Al Iverson. I am industry research and community lead here at Valamail with a long background in email deliverability. Was director of deliverability for one of those big marketing clouds for a good long while, good 15 years. And here at my role for DMARC service provider Valamail, it's all about community and connection, being able to get to know folks like you and figure out how we can help each other get through any troubles we may have together to properly implement email authentication and DMARC and all that happy stuff. Jen.
Yes, so Al already talked a little bit about why we're having this specific webinar, but why is all of this happening? We're going to talk a lot about Microsoft, but this originally kicked off October 2023, and we'll get to some of those details later. But this is all about, it seems new because the word requirements there, but really this has been all the things that are being touted are best practices, and they've been around for much longer since 2023, probably decades or at least a decade. And really, they're trying to push forward these best practices that are now requirements because it really helps them pull apart the bad mail from the good mail. So when you aren't using, for example, your own domains and authenticating with them, it's harder to tell if this is a good sender's mail or just a sender's mail that's getting mixed in with the shared environment that's going out, or if the mail is spoofing someone or something along those lines. So it's really to help the filters better identify what's coming in, because the mailbox providers really want their users to be happy. If their users aren't happy and getting the mail that they want, and if they're not filtering out the mail that they don't want, there's other platforms out there that they can use as well. I've talked to many postmasters and they all say, we want them to get the mail. We just don't want them to get the bad mail. And so some of the other things is that when you authenticate too, you're also identifying that this is your mail and that you are hopefully a good sender, and whatever signals tie to those domains that you're using are your signals. So that again helps to identify your behavior and who you are as a sender. It's all about best practices and being able to tie again your behavior to your domains and the data that you're using. And it doesn't matter who you know. This is all machine driven. There's algorithms there, and that really determines where your mail is going, not if you know somebody who works at that company. So you often hear MAGY. This is Microsoft, Apple, Gmail, and Yahoo. These are the biggest providers out there, especially in the US when we look at the distribution there. It's a little different when you're talking about other countries and regions, but in the US, this is the top four. And this is for consumer mailboxes. There's a different breakout when you think about B2B, but Apple and Microsoft do fill that void quite a bit when you think B2B. And then these best practices, they're not just today, they're going to be lasting. There might be changes to make them a little bit more strict, perhaps, or changing thresholds, because after right now, for example, policy of none is a lot of the requirement. But I imagine that as time goes on, that's going to be a little bit more strict to say, okay, now that we've had you meet the baseline, let's bump it up a notch because there's still gaps. So these best practices, if they're adjusted and as they're adjusted, it's to help fill gaps so that, again, the bad mail continues to get blocked out and your good mail is in there and protected, as well as the customers being protected.
So we do talk a lot about B2C here and throughout, and some of you might be B2B senders and you're asking, well, why do we focus on this? And that's because As you'll see in the chart here when we compare MAGY in a bit. Um, the providers have really started with these requirements from the perspective of B2C consumer mailboxes. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I think the primary one is that it's a mostly homogeneous single environment population for them. So it's a place where they can change the rules because it's one environment and it's their environment, as opposed to if you think of Microsoft, right? They are totally in control of policies and procedures for Outlook.com, the free webmail consumer mailboxes that you can go sign up for today. When it comes to hosted Microsoft business mail, right? Think of Microsoft 365, what used to go through a different bunch of different names in the past, from hosted exchange to enterprise exchange online and all that stuff. But those are affected by contracts, right? They're contractual agreements with customers, and in some cases, it might not be as easy for them to just change the rules. And they're a little more sensitive about accidentally negatively impacting business mail that somebody is paying for. And so that's probably why you're seeing a lot of these requirements start with the B2B. But the reason in the last slide why we said this is future proof is because we think these requirements are also going to spread to B2B as well. We think the B2C is just sort of the proving ground, the first step in a process where effectively all mail is going to require this. So though we focus on B2C a lot here, keep in mind that, again, these are very future-proof for B2B as well. But even in the B2C realm, right, these mailbox providers, MAGY, are huge. This is the snapshot of provider data from I think, actually, if it's the snapshot, I think it is from a a nightclub in San Francisco. The guy who just sort of broke down his data, showing exactly who signs up to get emails to buy tickets for shows at this nightclub. And this is a great microcosm of snapshot of what a B2C list breakdown can look like. It varies for some people, but it's in broad strokes, it's always like this. Gmail is the biggest, Google is the biggest. Yahoo and Microsoft and Apple and Comcast are all in there as well. And then everything else sort of falls into the rest. But you can see, even in this tiny little snapshot, that these providers matter significantly. And I wanted to call out a couple of them too, right? You might think, oh, Microsoft is just Outlook.com, and it's, well, it's third, it's an also ran, but they really are important because they have more than 400 million B2C users across 168 domains, right? They have a whole bunch. You don't always see these, but they have a whole bunch of different domains for different locales and brands, right? Hotmail.es for Spain, hotmail.fr for France. But they also have these legacy domains, a lot of which are still alive, like live.com, msn.com. Believe it or not, webtv.net, that still exists. That's still a mailbox that you can still send mail to. And these are all consumer domains hosted by Microsoft that fall under these requirements. Yahoo, another one that people don't really think about, especially if they think, well, they don't really seem to show up, or people don't ask about them. Do people still use Yahoo? Yes, they do. Yahoo is growing. Yahoo Mail is growing year over year, and they have a lot of brands, and they host a lot of mail for different internet service providers. AT&T is in the process of fully moving their email domains over to Yahoo. They have sort of hosted it in a hybrid fashion for a long time, but now they're totally taking it over. They have also taken over hosting mail for Canadian provider Rogers, for smaller broadband providers here in the US, Frontier and CityLink, for Cox Cable, for the UK-based Sky, for Verizon.net, which was once a standalone provider. Those are all now Yahoo Mail. And our friend AOL too. Can't forget them. People still use AOL. My neighbor still uses AOL. Emails me from it every day. Cloudflare. The reason we threw this one in here too is because Cloudflare just announced that their mail forwarding service is requiring that the inbound mail coming to it be authenticated properly. Now, so that means that if you're using Cloudflare to capture and forward your inbound mail for a domain, they are now going to not forward mail when it doesn't pass authentication checks. Their goal there is to reduce the amount of time and effort to process spam, phishing, spoofing. So the goal there is that they hold it up, put it in a bucket, drop it on the floor. I'm not exactly sure. There's something with a log, and it goes in a log. I don't know if it goes into some sort of quarantine access or exactly how that works. But the net is that senders, again, this is not the Cloudflare user that has to comply. This is senders that are sending mail to that domain have to comply. And though Cloudflare was certainly not largely represented when we look at that B2C list breakdown, they host more than 30,000 domains of the top 10 million, meaning in my top 10 million that I've been looking at for a few years now, where I track what are the biggest domains by web traffic and who hosts mail for those domains. In that top 10 million list, more than 30,000 of them have MX records that seem to point to this Cloudflare service. So that is nothing to sneeze at, frankly. That's significant from a policy perspective, and it shows that broader convergence that we're going to talk more about in a little bit, about how basically it is becoming, you have to authenticate if you want to get mail delivered.
So timing's so important. I know we've been touched on this in the beginning, that best practices have been around for over a decade. But when this first rolled out, it was announced in October of 2023. I am pretty sure there was a collective gasp among all ESPs, and a please, please let us get some time to go through it because we're in peak season. And then it started to really roll out early 2024 in terms of enforcement. Apple added DMARC recs around March 2025. Microsoft announced theirs in April of this year as well, and stating that they're going to start actually enforcing it in May. It was really interesting watching that announcement roll out too, because it initially said, hey, if you're not in compliance, we're going to put you in the spam folder. And they found out, or they decided more, that it's going to be more confusing for a sender to understand why they're in the spam folder, because it could be just that they're having bad habits. So they decided to make a few tweaks that if you don't meet compliance, we're just going to block you. You're going to get that message, and it's going to be clear as to why you're not being delivered. So that rolled out in May. And then Cloudflare, as Al just went through, they announced their changes in June, and it applies on July 3rd and onward.
So let's play the requirements game.
I wish I had a hat or something.
Been practicing that radio voice all morning long.
So Microsoft, I know there's some questions coming in. Really what they're doing is they're taking what Yahoo and Google did as the foundation, and they're just kind of standing on the same foundation. It applies to bulk senders at 5,000 emails per day. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means, especially when we look at the big chart of what everybody is doing. They want SPF and DKIM to pass, and you also need a DMARC record with a P equals none. If you are in compliance with Yahoo and Gmail, you will be in compliance with those. You need some form of alignment that also helps DMARC pass, and what that means is either SPF has to align with your friendly from address, or DKIM has to align with your friendly from. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. You need a compliant P2 from address. In the requirements, they say that your visible address of one that customers see either has to be working and compliant and according to the specs, that it's formatted the right way, has a mailbox, or the reply to. If both work, that's even better. But you need at least one working. So if somebody tries to reach out to that address, it's not bouncing and giving them a negative experience. They talk about list hygiene and bounce management in their requirements. And really what they're saying is, if you get a bounce, stop mailing it, especially if this user doesn't exist. Be mindful of the messages and the signals you're also receiving back. List hygiene also incorporates consent and making sure that at some point in time, if users aren't engaging anymore, it's time to reconsider how you mail them. And then also they talk about transparent mailing practices. So no deceptive subject lines, make sure your unsubs are clear and easy to access, and that they work.
And a couple of notes there from me too. We talk. They touch on compliant P2 from address. P2, by the way, is a Microsoftism for the visible from address. Compliant means, and they sort of guide, they say that it accepts mail, that it's not an address that goes nowhere. Now everybody says, well, how do they test that? And the honest answer is, I don't know. We're not sure that they actually explicitly test that. And I think that's okay, right? They can lay out a requirement, what they want from people without having a way to necessarily do like a mechanical test to see if it passes. But keep in mind, you've got to meet the spirit of these requirements, because at some point you might need help from somebody at Microsoft. And if you want them to help you, they're going to look at and see, are you complying with all these things? And they might even look at some of them manually. And if they see that you're not complying with the letter or the spirit of them, they are less likely to assist you when you have trouble. And somebody had a question in chat too, like what constitutes good mail versus bad mail? And boy, that's a deceptively simple question with a very potentially complex answer. And good mail is good mail. It's wanted mail. It's mail with sent to people who have signed up to receive it, right? And well, some of the providers are more explicit. Some of them it's kind of nebulous. But if you wanted me to write it down on a bar napkin and say, here's everything you need to know about good mail and make it fit in a 4-inch square thing, then it's mail sent to people who want it, and it's mail that people are interested in, and it's mail that people are responding to. Think of all the bad stuff out there too, like phishing, spoofing, things trying to trick people, unwanted spam, unwanted, just weird stuff. I don't know what you get in your spam folder. I run a bunch of spam trap domains, and I just get some bizarro stuff. So there's people just trying to send stuff to annoy, to draw attention, to trick people, to get you to download malware, to give up passwords, to give up money. So those are examples of. Keep in mind that we, especially marketers, think of this all in the context of, will my valuable marketing email get delivered? But Microsoft is literally trying to keep people from stealing money from Outlook customers, right? That they really do have to worry about that. So they have bigger concerns, frankly, sometimes than whether or not your newsletter gets delivered. And that's where spam filters trip people up, right? Is the Microsoft and others are trying to make filters that catch all this bad stuff. And so it's very important that you don't make your good mail look like the bad stuff at all. And keep in mind that even with your best effort and Microsoft's best effort, sometimes they're going to get the filtering wrong. They might accidentally filter your stuff in their efforts trying to stop all this horrible stuff. So we put together this chart here of MAGY, the universe of MAGY, Microsoft, Apple, Gmail, Yahoo, as Jen touched on before. And here's a comparison of what's similar. This is aiming towards policy convergence, or convergence of requirements. And so it's kind of neat to see how basically they're coming at it from different places, right? They've got different user bases. The Gmail's got a different user base than Apple does, Microsoft similarly, but they're all sort of in their best efforts to let good stuff through and block bad stuff. They're all kind of coming towards similar policies, and especially the ones in yellow here are examples of where the stuff's really getting close to the same. What do you think, Jen? What are we missing here? Like, we look at some of this stuff too, like we're talking about good mail versus bad mail. Here's an example of how mailbox providers measure that under spam complaint rate threshold, right? They look at whose mail generates the most spam complaints, because everybody's got that report spam button, right? Where do you think that data goes, right? It goes into the filtering engine, the determination mechanism that decides whether or not you're a good sender or a bad sender. That is just one of the signals that is fed into that. So if you're generating spam complaints, you're more likely to get blocked. And what generates spam complaints? People don't want the mail. They don't recognize the sender. They didn't sign up for it. They didn't give permission. It's abusive and unwanted in some way. So think about all the different ways that you can be potentially annoying to recipients, right? Buying lists, emailing people constantly, sending off brand content. They sign up for one thing and they get something else. These are all things that are contribute to the sort of the sour taste in a subscriber's mouth that drive those spam complaints.
Yeah, when I look at these requirements, some of them might not say exactly the same verbiage, but there really is the same underlying message behind it in terms of, so for example, list management um, row there. Google and Yahoo are specifically saying, certain things, a couple of them say prohibits purchase list, maybe one of them doesn't. But at the end of the day, they really all are talking about consent. And that's really what it boils down to, is they want you to mail customers who have asked for it explicitly, not through maybe a gray connection that you've made with them, but that they said, I want you to mail me these types of messages. There's also, when you look at some of the metrics, I think senders might see a number and they're like, that's the number, it's a hard number. But really, when you start working with the mailbox providers and you start working with your customers, the idea is that these numbers are a guide. It's kind of like a little flex point. Again, right, requirements might change up or down. They put 5,000 on there because it helps perhaps mute out some of the questions that aren't as important to these requirements as others, like authentication and making sure you're sending wanted mail. But it gives a point to say, I know, like a sender who sends 10 emails a day, maybe I don't throw the hammer at them just yet because they probably don't even know what SPF is. But if you're sending a significant volume, and that's kind of what number do we throw at it? Let's throw 5,000. Then you should know, or your provider should know, how to get you set up to send the mail. And so if you see 5,000 a day, you might be categorized if you're 4,000. And it's all about, are you sending like mass email? It's not one-to-one. Are you sending it consistently and reaching out to customers? And that means that you should be abiding by sending behaviors that are best practices and that really take care of the customers who you're sending mail to. So I love how it's all turning yellow, because they're all on the same page. But I want to make sure that people looking at it, or senders looking at it, don't get so hung up on the numbers that they're forgetting the intent behind these requirements, which is so very important.
Jen, somebody had a great question in the chat that I'm not actually sure the answer to. I have a guess, though, and I'll share it. The question is a PTR record part of the sender requirements for MAGY? Now, what they mean by that, for those who don't understand what a PTR record is, basically they're talking about the DNS for the IP address, the host name for the IP address that is sending mail to Microsoft. And my guess is, and Jen, I'd love to hear your perspective too, is that I don't think Microsoft explicitly calls this out, but it is safe to assume that you probably do need a proper DNS record, the A record, the pointer record for your IP, to be able to send mail to Microsoft. If not just for Microsoft, for everybody else. I know historically that if AT&T and T Online and others cannot resolve a pointer record for your IP, they do not accept the connection at all. And I think it is typically a strong or strongish spam sign to have an IP address with no proper DNS on it.
I agree. Google and Yahoo both mention it, so I would just say do it. If it's in one of them, do it for all. And I do know some B2B security appliances do look for the PTR as well. Not just that it exists, but that when you look it up, it matches in the reverse order, and in some cases doesn't match the hello, or is just like the overall domain aligning. So and that's something, if you are a sender, your ESP should help you work through. Sometimes they will brand it with their own domain, and sometimes they'll have you brand it. So that might differ, but definitely having some type of value for your IP and that you can reverse look it up is very important, and they do look for that. So we mentioned briefly about permission and consent. So when we think about Microsoft, they say you need an easy unsubscribe, do not buy list, keep your complaint rates low, and ideally, if you're getting consent the right way, and by right way, it's clear that you're also setting expectations up front. And it's not just, well, you bought something, therefore you're going to get my marketing. It's a specific, I want this type of messaging. And then it's wanted and engaging. Now I know that some senders are working through, how do I make this content even better? But really, if someone's signing up for it, there's something there that they want, some value they want from you. So that's what Microsoft is asking. When you get to Yahoo and Google, they take it another step further, and they say we need the one-click unsubscribe, which is in the header. It's not a click the unsubscribe in the body and it's one click. Don't do that, please, because there are scanning appliances that might accidentally unsubscribe users. but it's a different requirement. And again, the ESP usually handles that piece of it, but that's another step to really help their users kind of weed out any false signals from spam complaints. Microsoft doesn't yet have that as a requirement, but they still say make that unsubscribe easy. If that means, add it to the top as well, then add it to the top. If it means making the font a little bigger, make it a little bigger. If people are going to unsubscribe, they're going to unsubscribe. Tiny font's not going to keep them from doing that. So just make it easy so they don't have to scan and work a lot. The more that they have to do work, the more likely they're probably going to go to that spam button.
I really want to bang the drum. I want to stand on top of the mountain and scream about alignment and what is alignment and why it matters so much, especially with Microsoft here, because Microsoft and some of these other providers directly or indirectly call out alignment as a requirement. They might frame it as DKIM alignment, they might frame it as SPF alignment, they might frame it as DMARC alignment. But in a nutshell, alignment is all one thing, and that one thing is this. Alignment is when the domain name in the header that has email authentication matches the domain name that is in the visible from address. That is alignment in a nutshell. So if you're talking about, does your email have DKIM alignment? That means that your domain matches in both the visible from address and that hidden DKIM signature header. See the D equals there in the example on the left. That's also in that example, that's SPF is aligning there too. There's a header that's called the envelope from or a return path header. That's part of the SMTP transaction when mail servers are talking to each other. That does the domain match there. So that's a perfectly matched example of alignment. Bad guys are prevented from successfully aligning because of the requirements around SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. DMARC prevents bad guys from being able to authenticate as you, and thus they might try to pretend to be you by putting your address in your domain in the from address, but they're not able to put your domain in the DKIM signature because it won't pass because they don't have access to your DNS. They can't put the necessary encryption keys in DNS. They don't have access to your SPF record, so they can't successfully use your address in the return path header and have it match SPF authentication. So that's what alignment boils down to. Alignment under DKIM, alignment under DMARC means either SPF alignment or DKIM alignment or both. You will often see email service providers. Think of MailChimp, think of Aweber, think of Constant Contact, and a whole bunch of other platforms that are very good at sending mail. And you should use all of them. They are awesome. But the point is some of them will not be able to do SPF alignment. They will set their own return path domain necessary to track bounces. That's okay. If you have, because like I said before, if you have SPF alignment or DKIM alignment, that is good enough to pass DMARC, to have DMARC alignment, to have DMARC success and DMARC alignment. So sometimes you will see confusion, and I full well admit even our own reporting can confuse the point that lack of SPF alignment does not mean failure. So if you are sending through, for example, MailChimp, and you're passing DKIM's aligning, but SPF says not aligned, that's okay. That's how a platform like that works. As long as DKIM is configured and aligning, you're good. And that's an important setup step for you to set when you send on those platforms. You have to proactively enable DKIM, email authentication for your domain. All these different platforms have guides, whether it be an ESP platform like the ones I just talked about, or Microsoft 365, or Google Workspace. Any place you're sending email from for your domain, DKIM is a must-have. You need DKIM alignment to succeed here, and that's good enough. And if some platforms don't fully support SPF alignment, that is okay. Proactive setup, that's the thing. The confusion point here that people have is that they will use an online tester and it says DKIM pass, but DMARC fail. And why is that? And that's because of a lack of alignment. So let's talk about when things go wrong, what can go wrong, and what to do about it. And this is a big problem for people right now. There's a lot of people struggling. When you look at the actual requirements, there's a link there in the corner. This is to the actual requirements published by Microsoft. This is the error message they give when you fail their checks, primarily authentication checks. That's what they're telling you here. And there's a lot of different things that can set that off, and some of them can be really confusing. In fact, there's one question in the Q&A that's a really good one. It's a little technical. We'll get to it here in a second. That there's a lot of things in the air, a lot of things all happening at once here, and it's not always easy to tell what's going wrong. So here's
Yeah,
some of the
so
things you can check.
exactly. So there's a number of things. So did you set up DKIM? I worked at Zeta in my former life, and one time we have, multiple mail servers, and we did have some where like a DKIM was set up on one mail server, but not another. So making sure DKIM is set up on the mail server, but is also having the correct key in the DNS. So sometimes I've even had cases where the mail server, the actual key that went with it was not the correct one that was shared with the client, and we had to update it. So those kind of testings can happen. If you're running already and it's working, you can still check to make sure that those things still exist, that nothing changed on the mail server. But usually when it starts to happen after everything's been validated, then you start to, you can double check with a about my email. Great tool from the Atkins. We can talk a little bit more about that and all the things it can check for, but it's a great way to easily check authentication. Other things that can break DKIM, was it forwarded? Um, Forwarding, especially if there's any rewriting, and depending on what was signed in that message, could easily break the DKIM signature, because the DKIM signature is really saying, this is the content as it was when it went out the system. And these are all the pieces that I'm saying existed and exactly what they existed when it went out. If it was received and altered in any way, think about redirects, if they were changed with Microsoft Defender links or something like that. Now, when that email is trying to be recreated to compare to the original, it looks different. So DKIM fails. Sometimes there's a DNS issue where the DNS just drops and they can't connect to it to check that DKIM signature and that DKIM key. And in that case, sometimes it just happens and you need to fix it. There's also TTLs, which is like how long the record should be remain in cache before you need to go check it again and see if anything has changed, and refresh your cache. If they're very low, Microsoft tends to have issues. Not necessarily a problem with the other providers, but it has been something that's been tested, and we're seeing for some that a very low TTL can cause problems. So aim for maybe 3600 or higher. And then if things are encoded, sometimes Microsoft will decode and recode as they receive it. And in doing so, it now looks different again from what was originally sent out. And so that can break DKIM. So ways to check encoding is sometimes you can slice your content down into little pieces to figure out, when I send it this time, is it breaking DKIM? And at what point does it? And then you can scan in there. Sometimes you can have these little hidden characters that as soon as you take them out, DKIM passes. So sometimes it's just a very tedious process to research and find out if there's a particular character that is breaking the signature.
It is very tedious, and if thinking about having to troubleshoot all this stuff annoys you, you are not alone. It can be frustrating, especially the weird stuff. You talk to somebody who's a DKIM expert about forwarded mail, and they will say, "What? DKIM is supposed to survive forwarding just fine." Yes, but right, there's little bits of rewriting that can make a signature break, like Jen said, like wrapping the links for security checks, re-encoding special characters. Years ago, it used to be as silly as tabs to spaces. That on inbound mail, Microsoft would rewrite it, and that would break the signature. Now, in this modern age, it's a little bit more complicated. It can be stuff like the order of the MIME headers, or it can be emojis or other stuff that you wouldn't visibly see when you just eyeball it, because how an email is rewritten on the back end, it doesn't matter to you when you look at it and it visually looks the same. But that does matter to that authentication signature, to that DKIM signature. If it changes, it fails. One of those things that I talked about before when I was complaining loudly about alignment, is when one of these errors you can get is, and it says DKIM pass, but I'm getting DMARC fail. And that is something that people are running into specifically with Microsoft here. And that is usually because, like I said, about when you're sending from a platform like a MailChimp, like Aweber, Constant Contact, etc., you need to proactively set up DKIM for your domain. If you see this type of error, you look at the results and it says DKIM pass, DMARC fail, check the DKIM signature header. Is it your domain in that DKIM hidden header, right? View source, view headers. And a lot of the time, what you'll find here is that it's not your domain, it's the default domain. Like, MailChimp has a set of subdomains under mcsv.net or something like that. They add their own DKIM signature. Platforms do this for abuse tracking and Google Postmaster tools, Yahoo Feedback Loop, other reasons to add their own signature to be able to sign the messages saying it came from their platform. So if you don't also enable your domain to be signed with DKIM from that platform, the default platform signature, the MailChimp signature, the Aweber signature, whatever, it's going to be the only DKIM signature in that message. It's not going to match your visible header, and it's not going to pass DMARC because of a lack of alignment.
We briefly talked about my.email. This is a great tool. I love it. I think everybody who uses it loves it. It's very trustworthy, third-party tester. When you go to their site, it's going to give you an address, and it's comes up with just random words from lists to put together an address for you. And sometimes they're hysterical. So it's fun to just go and see what address is created. You take that address, do not close the page, go to your provider, send a test. And depending on the provider, sometimes tests go out differently than what a live message is. So you have to know that if you need to actually send a live campaign or if you can send a test, but send it to that address. That page will then refresh. And then you're going to want to save that link if you ever want to look at it later. But that will have a whole bunch of compliance badges. And it's really focused on the technical aspects of these requirements. And it was built when Yahoo and Google released their announcements. So it's really focused on Yahoo and Google. But again, if you're compliant there, you should be compliant with Microsoft. There, they will tell you if authentication passes and if it aligns. And if it doesn't align, why? And you can start to dig in as you click and you can see, oh, this is an ESP branded domain, but it did pass SPF. This is my domain and it passed and aligned. And so you can really see where things fall there. They have other pieces on there for like TLS. They'll check the one-click unsubscribe, other aspects too for, again, Yahoo and Google that need to be met. And so you can check all of those things. And one thing that I think is important that I get a lot of questions from clients. I've done all the technical stuff, but I'm still having issues. And the technical stuff is just one piece of the puzzle. There's a whole bunch of activity and behavior that also flows into this sender requirements like spam reports and also what they expect of a sender so that they know you're sending wanted mail. First, you need to be technically sound. And then once you start mailing, you need to do the right thing. And so it's just a part of what you need to do to get to the inbox. And so keep in mind that just because you're compliant on a technical side, you may not be compliant on the behavior side.
I want to reinforce that because it's so important. Jen, in fact, I talked to a client yesterday that I'm probably going to recommend come to you for consulting because they sent me headers from their sends, sample messages they're sending from Salesforce Pardot. Everything looks great. They're passing SPF and DKIM and DMARC. Like I talked about, they don't have SPF alignment, but they do have DKIM alignment. Everything is good. Passes about my email checks is fine, but it's still going to the spam folder. And the important thing to remember here is DMARC, SPF, and DKIM, they do not guarantee inbox delivery. They are necessary. If you don't have them, you're going to struggle to get to the inbox, but they themselves alone do not guarantee inbox delivery. You have to be sending wanted mail. You have to have a good reputation. You have to be sending mail with permissions, got to have low complaint rates. That's where all those other requirements come in beyond the technical, right? They talk about being transparent with mailing practices. You saw that they're looking at complaint rates. Mailbox providers, especially Gmail, are looking at engagement. So it's not just technical. You've got to be sending wanted mail in enough. It's got to be wanted enough that people are actually opening and clicking it. And what constitutes as enough is not always clearly elaborated upon. A lot of these providers, you are basically being stack ranked against other senders, and then the worst ones just don't make the inbox. So it's not always exactly what the numbers are, but it's how you rank what compared to those others. Now, let's get technical. This aligns well with one of the questions in the Q&A. Maybe too technical for this call. I'm finding some domains with SPF success rates swinging wildly when the domains send only from MS Microsoft 365. TTL is 3600. I don't think it's a caching issue. What else could it be to narrow it down? So TTL and caching. TTL is the setting for how long is the cache for DNS. That's a setting in seconds. When we talk about 3600 being a recommended default setting, that means 3600 seconds. That means that's how long DNS servers should cache, keep track of internally valid results. They look up what is the MX record for spamresource.com. They find that it's Google Workspace. They can cache that for however many seconds in my TTL so that they don't have to look it up again every time, go across the internet, grab it out of the phone book and write it down again. So that's caching for domains. And so Microsoft and some other places have trouble with very short TTLs. At least that's our strong suspicion right now. I don't know that that is really something that's on a guide that you can go point at right now, but if you're having trouble and if you have very tight, very small, like tiny little TTLs, that's something to try, is to set that longer. Now, a longer TTL means that when you make changes, it takes longer for them to show up. If you cache something for a year, it means you're only going to every time you make a change, it could take up to a year for it to show up everywhere, because people might cache it for the next 11 months if they've already looked it up in the last month, right? And so that can get really tricky, and people tend to want really short TTLs, but you have to sort of balance that in the context of where things can go wrong and things to try when you're having trouble. In this case specifically, um, forwarded mail is something that causes SPF failures. That would be the first place I would look in this case for this question in the Q&A. Forwarded mail always fails SPF. By its nature, SPF is a last hop authentication protocol. So it's only looking at what just connected to me to send me that email message. And so that sort of blows up when mail is forwarded between multiple servers. And it gets tricky. It's not always easy to do right. There's work in the industry standards group IETF to try to come up with a future version of email authentication that makes that a little more manageable, but that's a work in progress, and there's no perfect answers there. So if we're trying to figure out why you've got all these unexpected SPF failures, I'd try to understand, could it be forwarded mail? Can you tell what those sources are, and does it align with spoofing, or does it align with other mailbox providers, like maybe they're forwarding from Outlook to Gmail, or maybe it's alumni mailboxes for colleges are another example of broadly used forwarding that sort of doesn't necessarily play well with these modern authentication requirements. Forwarded mail to Microsoft is really difficult to do successfully now with these changes as well. So people out in the world, like, you can set up a Yahoo mailbox or a Gmail mailbox to have it forward all the mail somewhere else. Lots of places do that. There's online guides. I remember posting something about it on Spam Resource a couple years ago about how to set up forwarding in these different mailbox providers. Forwarded mail, where you're aiming to trying to deliver it to Outlook.com, probably doesn't work now because of these requirements. Because Microsoft says for bulk senders, if you're sending enough mail to get noticed, they require that SPF pass in addition to all this other stuff. But the one explicit point here is SPF passing, and forwarding does not pass SPF. Full stop. So all of these things here just kind of make it harder and fussier to get mail delivered to Microsoft. So here's the things to look at. Those are a few example of things to look at. To Jen's point, to content encoding, emoji encoding. Are you possibly doing something like base64 or quoted printable in a way that's out of spec, but maybe is being forgiven by Gmail, but not by Microsoft Outlook.com? Those are the kind of things to look at. Pretty technical stuff. It doesn't. If you're just a user of a platform like a Mailchimp or Aweber or Marketing Cloud, that's not really for you to fix. That's platform level stuff where the engineers behind the scenes really need to fix that. But it's stuff to be aware of and tell people to check for and test. And finally, DNS lookups. Intermittent DNS lookups are something that people are seeing spiking. And what that means is like trying to find an MX record or trying to look up the pointer record or trying to look that up. It might work 99.9% of the time, but if it's failing 0.01% of the time and you're sending a billion messages, that's still a lot of messages that are failing DNS when they shouldn't because you think you've got it right. So checking for that by, for example, checking all of the DNS servers for a domain. If you use my little Wombat mail tool, for example, you can say, um, check public DNS, yes, check special DNS, have it check multiple DNS servers to see are all of your DNS servers, the multiple ones that are set up for your domain, maybe it's from your domain registrar, a GoDaddy or a Namecheap or hover.com, or maybe you're using Azure DNS or Amazon's Route 53 or Cloudflare. They all have multiple servers, and so you can actually query and tell when in a lookup tool what server you're querying. Query multiple ones. Query public DNS servers. There's DNS servers out there like Quad9 and Cloudflare's 1.1.1.1 and others where you can just query other servers to see do they all give the same response. That is, again, it's nerd level stuff. I'm not expecting you as a newsletter publisher to necessarily know that stuff, but if you want to get technical, those are the other things you can try and or recommend your consultant or platform test, right? To be able to query multiple DNS servers, making sure they're all giving the same responses.
Al, how do we get a nerd level badge?
I'm working on it. At first, apparently I did it just by getting old. It's not so much that I actively learned stuff along the way. I just sat there and the knowledge came to me in little drips over the past 25 years. I don't recommend it as a way to learn stuff. It doesn't the amount of knowledge at a time is a little lighter than I kind of hope for. But if you want to learn more, that's a good segue, Jen. I think that worked out well. If you want to learn more, here's some links to that stuff. Microsoft, by the way, this XNND thing is my own short linker. I was using one of the common public short linkers, but they started shutting my links off and wanted more money. And so I have my own little domain. So that's my short linker. So that's not some scary thing that's going to hurt you. That'll just take you directly to, for example, on that first link, Microsoft's page where they announce their sender requirements. They go into detail there. We've got our compliance guide that we published. Jen has done some excellent stuff. She's talked about this and much more deliverability related stuff on the Kickbox blog. There's a link to that stuff there too. And I've got my spam resource blog at spamresource.com that I've been publishing for almost 24 years, I think. Yeah, it's been a while. So please do read all of those. We've got a couple of minutes left. What do you think, Jen? Should we try to answer one or two more questions?
Yeah, I'd love to. I
How
just
about
want
this one?
to
Okay,
hear
let's
the
talk about
trick.
subdomains. Where do subdomains fit into the discussion? And by the way, this person gets extra nerd points for working in a mention of contoso.net, which is one of Microsoft's example domains. Um, if I have a reputation dip on marketing.contoso.net, the subdomain, due to spam complaints, how does that or does that negatively impact the reputation of the organizational domain, the higher level of the domain, contoso.net, and all other subdomains? So, Jen, an excellent question. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You might actually know more than me about this. Like, it feels like it's kind of an amorphous, hand wavy thing of how does one subdomain's reputation affect other subdomains
Mhm.
and or the top level of the domain?
Yeah, so I love using the word it depends, and every mailbox provider will deal with this differently. They might have a different weight on how important each one is and how they weigh against each other. But in my experience, a subdomain really has its own reputation. It kind of sits in its own little world. And it only starts to leak out when it's really bad. And that negative leak could go up and it could go down. With the organizational domain, usually that again holds its own reputation and it's not really impacted by the subdomains unless, of course, again, there's leakage from them that's like really bad And maybe there's many subdomains that are bad, and it's starting to look like they're trying to hide activity amongst subdomains. And so everything ultimately, when you look at Google Postmaster tools and you look at the compliance there, everything rolls up to the top domain. So if you're not in compliance there and you're having issues, they're going to look at the top domain to say, hey, are you following the guidelines, even if you're on a subdomain? They probably still look at it separately, but everything ultimately rolls up. Again, it's to help protect those who are like, I'm just going to spin up 100 subdomains and say I'm fine. They roll it up and they look at the overall activity. But they really do, like when I have a client struggling on a subdomain, we do use different subdomains to help separate, to say like, this is your transactional, let's protect it on its own subdomain. And you have marketing on another one. So if something does happen with marketing, ideally transactional will be protected. Again, if you go beyond the acceptable level of oops, then it can start to interfere with one another. Anything in email, what I've learned, domain wise, no matter if it's subdomain, organizational domain, somebody else's domain, pieces of content, hashed pieces, anything can impact anything. So everything is looked at and measured and weighed, and then it filters into an overall view of who you are as a sender. I'm getting on a tangent there, but I'll stop.
That's very helpful, and it is important to talk about. And we're going to squeeze in two quick more questions. This one, I promise you, I'm not being a smart aleck, but they're asking, when I look at reports, the forwarded emails are not in alignment. Is there anything I can do about this? The answer is no. Unfortunately, it is no, full stop. Forwarding blows up SPF alignment as well as blowing up SPF authentication, and it's a bummer. So, and finally, I think, Jen, this is a good one for both of us. Let's talk about spam traps. I understand how spam traps work, but they seem to be more prevalent with Microsoft. We validate the emails through the system. Question disappeared in a second here. I'm scrolling down. We validate these emails through a system before sending them, yet every once in a while we still seem to send an email to a spam trap. Are there any other preventative measures that you or anybody else aware of? Jen, you work for an email verification provider called Kickbox. I think
Mhm.
let's talk about it's not a failure of Kickbox by any means, but email verification platforms in general. People think they can sort of magically find and kill spam traps, but they don't, right?
Right. We know of some spam traps, so we don't release them. We do that for reasons that if you have spam traps, verification isn't really probably what's going to be your solve. You probably have other issues because there was probably a consent issue there. And even if you don't have the spam traps, you still have others that probably didn't likely consent. But spam traps are designed to not be found. And so even if you are able to identify well-known ones, there's definitely those in there that you're not going to know about. And they're owned by many different companies, and they're monitored. Even looking at, they're not spam traps. So if you think about an inactive account, somebody who has an account that delivers, but there's nobody home, the mailbox provider knows there's nobody here and people are still getting mail there. So it's all about behavior, and prevention is just really looking at your metrics as best you can. I know they're all flawed, but is this person interacting in a way that's valuable? Are they interacting at all? When's the time they signed up? What value are they bringing to your list and your company? And testing different ways to reach out to them. You don't have to reach out to them every time. Maybe you say, you know what, we'll bring it on a quarterly, and we'll try re-engagement. We'll give them something special. It really depends on the type of messaging that you're sending out. Newsletters different than commerce, but there's lots of different ways that you can strategize about mailing them so you're not hitting them all the time, you're not annoying them, driving complaints, and so on.
Thank you, Jen. This has been fantastic, everyone. You've been so interactive in the chat, and I appreciate all of you. I think we're going to wrap it up there because we are just over time, and I want to be mindful of that. And I know we've all got stuff to do, and then we want to get on to the weekend as quickly as possible. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you for your interactivity. Thank you for putting up with our silly polls, and thank you for pretending that we have something useful to say. I think it's kind of fun to share what we know. It's great. The reason I do this is to help rise the tide, right? A rising tide lifts all boats. We want to make email better. We want to protect the email ecosystem, make it useful, keep it useful. And your participation is a fantastic part of that. So thank you all so much. And Jen, thank you so much for your participation and expertise today. I really do appreciate you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody.
Have a good weekend, all. Bye-bye.